Was Leif Erikson. Välkommen till Amerika i trakaskipan ju att frusna sabati och vilja utprosträva Oden!
Frakotteetite. Du madur etor förbjufike. In ein ut i ringat Leif Erikson. Literatur ut brakot bruse. Braket in ein brusidi. Kristen tro is ook brata de liefen min. En altor mator alger gengal de söta dräcker. Happy Leif Erikson Day. Skål! Good stuff. So we all know his name, and we all know that he was the first European explorer to set foot on North American soil. But what kind of man was Leif Erikson? Well, pretty much all we know about his life comes from two short Icelandic sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, which roughly describe the same events but contradict one another at several key points. The saga of the Greenlanders was written first, so it's generally considered to be more reliable. But the saga of Eric the Red has a lot of great biographical information about Leif's family, so by putting the two sagas together and sort of picking out information that might be useful, we can make a pretty solid, educated guess about the personality of the man who first discovered America. Spilled meat on my hand. The first thing we're pretty sure about is that Leif was never a Viking. Yeah, he was a Norseman, but he never went a Viking or, off raiding in search of plunder and profit. So did Leif hop off the boat in Canada going, "Ah!" Well, sorry to disappoint, but almost certainly not. Leif probably dressed a little something like this. Pretty typical garb for a well-to-do Norse farmer of the late Viking age. I've added a little pewter crucifix to my impression here. Was Leif a Christian when he landed in North America? Probably. Not certainly, but probably. A lot of online sources will state it as definitive fact that Leif was converted to Christianity by King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway and ordered by the king to evangelize the Greenlanders. Though there is actually some pretty compelling... Oh God, spilling my meat all over the place. There is actually some pretty compelling evidence to suggest that this meeting never took place at all and that it was invented centuries later by an Icelandic monk. I also find it hard to believe that Leif was a dedicated pagan. He was a very well-traveled young man, and in the year 1000 it would have been very hard for Christianity not to have rubbed off on him in some way. Now his father, Eric the Red, was a super dedicated pagan, but that's not really that surprising. I mean, he was an old man in a rapidly changing world. But one of the claims in Eric's saga does actually correspond to the archaeological evidence: the rapid conversion of Leif's mother, Theodhild. So she built a church out of turf and wood, very, very close to Eric's farmstead at Brattahlid. So turf and wood, that tells archaeologists that this church was built in the very early 11th century. All of the other Norse churches in Greenland are made of stone. And considering it was so close to the family home, I mean, I really don't see any other explanation in that other than that she built it. Also, by the way, Theodhild refused to have sex with Eric until he too had converted, which annoyed him greatly. But anyway, let's move on to the famous journey of discovery that Leif took around the year 1000. Once again, the two sagas disagree on how exactly he went about it. In the saga of the Greenlanders, one Bjarni Herjolfsson gets blown off course by a storm, and he sights three lands to the west, ends up settling in Greenland, where Leif was growing up, and years later, Leif buys his ship and goes on his own expedition to explore these three lands discovered by Bjarni. But in Eric's saga, it's Leif who's blown off course by a storm when he's visiting the king in Norway, and he discovers these American lands whose existence he had never even suspected. Once again, I lean pretty heavily toward the saga of the Greenlanders' explanation of events, because Iceland and Greenland were discovered in just the same way. Somebody got blown off course by a storm, they sighted the land, they turned back, and then later on, somebody else followed up on that and went to actually land and explore these places. The Greenlander saga also just has much more detail in their account of that first journey to America, so I'm going to be pretty much going off of the saga of the Greenlanders from here on out. According to the saga, Leif landed in 3 places. The first was Helluland, land of flat stones. The second, Markland, land of trees. And the third, finally, famously, Vinland, land of grapes, or berries, or wine, or meadows. Really kind of depends on who you ask. The exact translation is very hotly debated. Oh, how did meat get on my sleeve? Traditionally, the 3 lands have been identified as Baffin Island, Labrador, and Newfoundland. And if you look at it on a map, it makes sense. The saga does identify these lands as 3 very distinct places. But I don't entirely buy it, and I'm not alone in that. Many saga scholars have questioned this traditional belief. First off, let's just assume that the saga of the Greenlanders is an accurate account of the expedition. I know that's a big assumption to make. I do consider it a fairly reliable account, but it's a big leap going from this is a fairly reliable account to this is exactly what happened. But it's also the only thing that we have to go off of here. So here's how the saga describes Helluland. By the way, I'm going off of the Magnus Magnusson translations of the Vinland sagas, which I realize is aging, but it's the only one I have on hand, so bear with me. So, Helluland. There was no grass to be seen, and the hinterland was covered with great glaciers, and between the glaciers and shore the land was like one great slab of rock. It seemed to them a worthless country. Yes, that does sound like Baffin Island, but it also sounds like many coastlines in this subarctic area. Again, on a map, it looks like there are 3 distinct looking lands, but at sea level, the perspective is very different. And much of the coast of Labrador does fit this Helluland description, even taking into account 1,000 years of climate change. So if you're sailing along the coast in your longship with no knowledge of the eastern Canadian seaboard, I find it highly likely that if you land here, then put out to sea, lose sight of land for a bit, go down the coast and land here, it might very well seem like a new island, especially since the ecology would be so drastically different. Next we have Markland, the land of trees. Here's what the saga has to say about it. This country was flat and wooded, with white sandy beaches wherever they went. The land sloped gently down to the sea. Well, that definitely sounds like southern Labrador. Fun fact, it's very probable that Norse Greenlanders throughout the rest of the Middle Ages went back to Markland many, many times for wood. So, you know, pretty cool, right? Now we come to a possibly vital but often overlooked part of the saga. After leaving Markland, Leif sailed on a northeast wind to Vinland for 2 days. To me, that screams a journey across the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Personally, I think Markland was used to describe both southern Labrador and Newfoundland, and that the famous archaeological site at Lonso Meadows in northern Newfoundland was not Leifsbuthir, or that first settlement that Leif founded, it means Leif's houses, but that it was a way station, someplace to repair your ship before a more arduous journey further south. Damn, this meat is good. But let's get back on topic. What does the saga's description of the voyage tell us about who Leif was as a person? Well, we do have a literal description of Leif's personality in the sagas, just a throwaway line. It says, Leif was tall and strong and very impressive in appearance. He was a shrewd man and always moderate in his behavior, but really wouldn't put too much stock in the saga's description of their heroes. I mean, the protagonists of Icelandic sagas were like the frickin' action heroes of their day, man, and they would often go out of their way to describe how handsome and clever and wonderful their main characters were. No, instead, let's look at Leif's actions in the saga. Actions speak louder than words, after all. So after landing in Vinland, Leif and his men put up the winter camp, Leifsbuthir. Again, Leif's houses. We don't know where exactly that was. But they decided to put up this camp, and they spent the winter in Vinland, and they organized exploring parties. Basically, half of the men would go off and explore the countryside, and the other half would remain at Leifsbuthir. Now, this was probably a pretty sound strategy, especially since the Norse were unaware of the presence of Native Americans at this point. Leif would take turns performing these duties. One day he'd go off with the exploring party, the other he would stay at the camp and manage things there. One night, Leif's foster father, Tryggir, who is described as a southerner, so probably a German, got separated from an exploring party. So Leif rebuked his men severely and set off with 12 men to find him. When they finally did, Trikir was babbling on in his native language, pulling all sorts of faces, very, very excitable. So they finally got him to calm down and talk to them in Old Norse. And he revealed, very famously, that he had discovered grapes, or maybe berries. Again, so very contested translation. But in any case, those grapes/berries are what gave Vinland its name. What these episodes tell me is that Leif was probably someone who led from the front, and also somebody who was very invested in the well-being and safety of his crew. This is supported by his actions upon returning to Greenland. So come spring, Leif's men loaded their ship with timber and grapes/berries, and they headed home. Favorable winds took them all the way back to Greenland. But as they were nearing Brattahlid, Leif saw something weird off in the distance. None of his other men could see it, but he could see just a little bit of a dark shape off on the water, so he steered a little bit closer to it. Turned out to be a reef, and on that reef were 15 shipwrecked Vikings. So Leif rescued them. He even allowed them to take as many of their belongings as could fit on the boat. And when he returned home, he got the nickname Leif the Lucky. I think this behavior demonstrates a sense of honor and compassion that was by no means ubiquitous in medieval Norse culture. I mean, when your nickname is Leif the Lucky, and there are a bunch of guys running around nicknamed Skull Splitter, then you're probably a pretty decent guy. So as we celebrate Leif Erikson Day this year, keep in mind you're not just raising your glass to a daring explorer. There have been plenty of those throughout history, most of them douchebags. You're also raising your glass to a good man, and that's a far rarer thing. This video is brought to you by Phil McCracken of McCracken Plastering. Phil will fill any crack in, slathering white plaster all over the cracks of walls in your home, or your office, or your school, or your church, or your... Wait, no, this is... Oh yeah, this is just Evan Jennis fucking with me again. Happy Leif Erikson Day, Evan.